Great. So thank you all so much for joining. This is a fantastic turnout. Welcome to the second in our mini webinar series, in which we are looking at the opportunities presented by new and emerging operational models to deliver cash more effectively, efficiently, and accountably. I'm delighted to be joined by so many of you today and to welcome an excellent panel to help us understand how we're doing at increasing accountability to and the participation of recipients of cash in cash delivery, and what the evidence says about where we can do better. So, as several of you on this call also joined us last week, I will speed through this intro, but in essence, what we're trying to do with this webinar series is point to the fact that as we see a massive growth in the scale of cash and voucher delivery, so up from $2 billion in 2015 to $4.7 billion last year, this, of course, implies changes to the roles of humanitarian actors and the ways in which we work together. And over the past several years, we have seen an evolution in ways of working together, a number of new operational models, and we've bundled all of these diverse groupings, approaches, collaborative models under the heading of operational models. So CaLP defines an operational model as the overall structure, program design and implementation. And that obviously covers a broad range of collaborative approaches. I think you may have lost the screen. Let me share again. Okay, hopefully we're back on now. Yeah, this covers a broad range of collaborative approaches. So we've seen a number of new operational models emerge and develop over the past 18 months, notably the Collaborative Cash Delivery Network and the UN Common Cash Statement. It's two big new developments in this area. So CaLP has been working, the CaLP network has been working to build evidence around operational models for large-scale cash and voucher assistance, and particularly those who are delivering multi-purpose cash, using something that we call CTP, Operational Models Analytical Framework. And this, in essence, is just a simple toolkit to identify the features that influence quality, and that's efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability, and draw out the role that contextual factors play in the formation and evolution of operational models and on supporting or hindering positive outcomes. So our intent is to use this collective evidence base for all of us to develop guidance on the suitability of different operational models by context. This is a long way in the future at the moment, but we're in the evidence gathering stage. These developments, these new operational models present, of course, a huge opportunity to build on the best of what we've learned as a network about how to deliver more effective, efficient, and accountable cash assistance, and present unique challenges and opportunities which should drive system-wide learning and development. Apologies to those of you who sat through that exact slide last week. So the aim of this mini-series, leading up to our operational models event in Cash Week, is to take a deep dive into some of the key issues faced by these emerging models to understand three things. So first of all, what does best practice in this area look like? Second of all, what does the evidence tell us across all members of the CaLP network and beyond? What does the evidence tell us about what works? And therefore, C, what are the opportunities presented by the emergence of new delivery models and collaborative approaches to put this learning into practice and deliver better for people in crisis? So we're starting with this series of webinars today, looking at accountability for affected people and building on a brilliant panel last week on monitoring, evaluation and learning. You can find the recording on the CaLP website if you missed it, to survey the state of the evidence and to understand how emerging models might put this into practice. So we'll then run a major event during Cash Week in the first week of December to pull all of this together and understand how to make the most of these opportunities presented by emerging models to deliver better. And also to understand how we can learn from these models as they develop, tracking progress, capturing evidence, and driving system-wide learning. Just another plea to please mute your microphone if you're not talking. Thank you. So today we're focusing on how emerging models can put the people they serve at the center of their work and be truly accountable to them. And I think this is a hugely important area, of course, and one which we talk about a lot, we pay a lot of lip service to. And in reality, I think the evidence shows we're not always doing as good a job as we could be. So one of the big promises of delivering more cash was that this implies a transfer of power and resources from humanitarian actors to the recipients of humanitarian aid. The theory goes that as more cash is delivered, the role of humanitarian organizations shrinks or shifts from that of decider and provider to a role which is more about facilitating individuals and communities' own recovery. But we're still not really seeing this shift in practice. And in fact, the evidence shows that we're still not doing well on the very basic task that underpins this of listening to recipients and acting on what they say. So just our panelists will tell us much more about this, but to draw out one example, in ALNAP's 2018 State of the Humanitarian System report, limited progress was reported on accountability and participation across the humanitarian system since 2015. And it was found that while feedback systems are in place for many programs, they're not actually influencing decision making. They're not actually changing the course of programming. And the emergence here of new and evolving operational models provides a unique opportunity to build this in intentionally from the outset. So to build accountability to recipients into the models that we're developing as a central feature of our operational models and our collaborative ways of working. And today we'll hear from an expert panel on what's working well, what we know, and where we're falling short, to try and gather recommendations, ideas, and inspiration on what emerging models should consider to maximize accountability. So that's quite enough from me. I'm very much looking forward to handing over to our expert panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel today, who are going to help us understand the state of the evidence around accountability to affected people in cash and voucher assistance. Up first, we have Louisa Safaris, who's a senior program manager with Ground Truth Solutions. Louisa designs and manages projects to enhance accountability in a range of contexts, including for cash-based assistance, and previously worked with INGOs on cash, livelihoods, and protection. We'll then turn to Rachel Eichholz, who is Chameleon's cash specialist based in Beirut, and she coordinates the design and implementation of research and fieldwork activities, including work on accountability to affected populations, value for money, and outcome monitoring of cash assistance programs. Then, stepping out slightly outside of cash world, we turn to Alexandra Sickott-Levesque, who is the Community Engagement Manager at IFRC, supporting the Red Cross, Red Crescent, national societies globally in integrating community engagement approaches in their work. And she was formerly the Global Advisor on Community Engagement for UN OCHA. And last but not least, we'll turn to Astrid de Valin, who is the coordinator of the joint WFP-UNHCR project on mitigating the risk of abuses of power in cash assistance. And she is the former global coordinator of the IASC task team on accountability to affected people and prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. So we really have a bunch of big brains for you who can take you through the state of the evidence very comprehensively. So Louisa, we'll turn to you first, if we may. Louisa, what does Ground Truth Solutions' recent research tell us we're getting right in increasing our accountability to recipients? And what are the big areas in which we're falling short? And then, I guess, building on that, what do you see as the most exciting opportunities for models who are building their systems and approaches to work differently in this area? Over to you, Louisa.
Big questions. Thank you, Sophie. And it's great to see so many people on the call. Can I control the slides?
You can. There should be some little arrows in the bottom left of the screen if you hover over them. If you have any problems, let me know and I can take it. I don't know
if it's allowing me to.
Okay. And if not, then just shout slide at me and I will I'll move you on.
We can start with the cycle.
Sure.
So I think many of you probably know about Ground Truth Solutions, and those of you that don't, we're a small organization that does not implement cash or voucher assistance, but rather we work to amplify the voices of aid recipients, and in this particular case, CVA recipients, to influence decisions. The microphone, thank you. We've been working with a number of your organizations in the last few years to really understand what cash and voucher recipients are telling us. And we get asked the question, what is accountability to affected people? I mean, it is a buzzword that's coming up more and more these days. And so we try to describe it in the following way. There's first the giving account. So explaining as an aid organization and as a CVA provider, what you're trying to do and what are the objectives and how you hope to achieve them. There's taking account, which is listening to what people say, whether they are aid recipients or or communities affected by crisis. And then there's this third aspect, which I think we focus a lot on, which is being held to account. So giving people a chance to make complaints or to recourse certain actions. And that's all good and fine. But one of the things that we found as we're trying to work with agencies around this constituent voice cycle is, what do you do with this information? How do you take action on accountability? What does it mean to action this accountability? And I think that that's a particularly interesting question when we see all this work done on operational models. What is the most efficient? What's the most effective? So I thought I would take you, sorry, next slide, please. Take you through some of the data that you might be familiar with and some newer stuff that you may not have seen. But we found that there's a courtesy bias, as we say. So recipients are quite appreciative of the relationships they have with CVA providers. And so asking about accountability or satisfaction with certain operational models or payment systems doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because people say that it's all great. So we've been really working and trying to figure out what's important to people. And what you'll see is this idea of, well, flexibility in terms of the type of cash assistance, but reliability and trust rank very high for cash recipients. And that's where we see the opportunities to make models more accountable. Next slide, please. There's a lot of work to be done. And so those of you familiar with our user journey work last year, it started with a very simple survey, which didn't give us all the information we hoped to get, but there were some stark findings. And I think the main one is around kind of features of cash programs that remain a mystery. And this just kind of illustrates the issue of targeting. And I think there's definitely a feeling amongst certain cash providers that you hit a wall when it comes to kind of taking this feedback and turning it into action, or having some sort of course correction that makes it more accountable and yet answers to people's needs. And that's what we've been looking at with different operational models, is to figure out, okay, what information needs to be discussed and decided with cash recipients, and where can there be opportunities for people to influence the decision-making process. Right now, the focus on moving cash into the hands of affected people is that instead of a sector deciding what people need to receive, people are obviously taking that into their own hands. But this idea around decision-making of CVA and certain particular models, especially when we get at the larger scale, are still a mystery to people. Next slide, please. So and it's not to go through the user journeys, but we try also to kind of do a deeper dive into people's experiences. And I think one kind of lesson that we've seen different operational models take on, whether it's individual agencies implementing small or large cash, or going all the way to complex consortiums, is there really needs to be a mix of both. Well, quantitative data is great, but there needs to be an interaction with people at a personal level, so that we understand the lived experience. That really resonates, and often it's a great tool to bring back to communities themselves. So, for example, these maps have a visual element. Of course, there's the text, but we've actually used this to go back to cash recipients and say, how does this experience resonate with what's happened with you, and what are some of your recommendations around how to improve that? Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize what we've been seeing is that this lack of participation and communication tends to frustrate people, and it actually can lead to more stress and desperation. So there's a risk that regardless of the operational model, even though cash has a lot of different promises and assumptions around being a more flexible and empowering model, without this participation, without the communication, it can fall into the same traps as other types of assistance. Next slide. So when we see experiences are enhanced, and I think this is true for any modality, but also any model, is to have the right information, and people telling us that they want to be more meaningfully involved, and they want to feel safe and trust their interlocutors. Now, I want to be perfectly honest, these are great recommendations, and we get a lot of very incredibly useful suggestions from affected people. But what does it mean, actually? And how do agencies turn that into action? There's an idea around this idea of improving accountability that agencies or CVA providers are not doing enough. And that's actually not been our experience at all. There's a lot of community engagement. You've got different working groups dedicating entire work streams to this. You've got field teams out every day speaking with affected people and with cash recipients. But what we're hearing is that potentially it's not done in a way that matches the agency's expectations and priorities for efficiency or for accountability. For example, having a hotline or putting up suggestion boxes versus how aid recipients would like to interact with providers. Next slide. So what we've done now is we've looked back at approximately 20,000 surveys we've done across 11 countries over the past few years. And we've kind of seen what CVA recipients have told us over the past few years, and tried to see if the assumptions we have around cash are validated by them to understand if accountability is heading in the right direction in terms of the program objectives meeting people's expectations. So on the next slide, just briefly, there are a few points and you can just click through them, Sophie, thank you. The assumption that cash is better, that people prefer cash, yes, that is kind of ringing true. People are saying that they are more likely actually to have better satisfaction, but also ability to meet needs with cash. So in that sense, the move towards cash is promoting a greater accountability. You've got the next point around more cash is better. And I think many of you cash practitioners will find that an interesting, unsurprising, but I think reassuring finding is that people are telling us that essentially the more cash they receive, the better they are able to meet their needs and the better outlook they have on their future. And so this idea of trying to be accountable, you can keep that, that's fine. You can just put all 5 of them up. Trying to press for exactly what minimum expenditure basket and what percentage of the minimum expenditure basket should be the transfer value is less important to people than receiving as much as they can for as long as they can. We do see that people feel that cash promotes the choice and that they're able to better navigate difficult situations and particularly financial assistance more largely when they have this ability to choose. And we found also that larger transfers relate to those better outcomes. The point around kind of unrestricted or flexible cash is best. Unsurprisingly, there's a strong relationship between better accountability from people's perspective. So do they feel that they have the information? Are agencies giving account? Are they able to be listened to? Are agencies taking account? And are they able to hold agencies to account? The flexible cash they find does seem to contribute to those more positive outcomes, simply because people are able to take decisions without having to either sell the aid that they receive or having to conform to, let's say, program parameters or operational models that don't allow them to flexibly meet those needs. And then finally, there is an interesting finding, and I'm not a statistician, so I will not go into the average increase on the 5-point scale, but there is a correlation between cash promoting dignity and self-reliance, people feeling that they could live without aid in the future. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize, what do we feel that these new operational models can offer? I think there is a way to see that with these kind of larger scale operational models or these integrated operational models, there's the opportunity to better structure accountability. And that's to think about it in a more systematic way. It's not just about the cash coordination forums and AAP being integrated into those forums. It's about cash practitioners thinking about AAP first and foremost in the design, and then trying to incorporate it into the best practices, the same way that we've seen market analysis skills, needs assessments, targeting, M&E featured prominently in good programming for CVA. We're really seeing more of this push towards AAP. Next slide. And as it becomes more collective, as these operational models are suggesting, we wanted to highlight 2 risks, and then I'll kind of leave you with a quote and some food for thought there, is that the 2 primary risks we see happening is, one is that as the operational models grow in size and scope and integration of different systems, a lot of people on the ground are left wondering how as humanitarian agencies providing CVA, how collective AAP can relate to their project. So we hear this often, that the hotline is for technical issues around a payment system. How do we answer questions around targeting that come up on these hotlines? Or field teams saying, but I'm accountable, I'm talking to people every day. And the poor results that we see people, for example, not understanding how targeting is happening. I don't understand how this relates to my project. So there is a risk as these operational models grow and they're very centrally driven, that actually the people who are the frontline responders to not only humanitarian assistance, but also to accountability, may be left behind in that discussion. And they're a key piece in making sure that affected people can receive the information and be integrated into that system. And then the second risk is around the accountability for CVA being outsourced to some of these quote unquote specialized groups. A lot of responses now we see having communication, CWC, so communicating with communities groups, or AAP pilot working groups, as we've seen in other countries. And with that kind of outsourcing, there are some important messages around good programming more generally, whether it's targeting or communication and feedback mechanisms that are not specific to CVA. But we do see that there's still a lot of room to kind of figure out what is appropriate for CVA actors to be heavily involved in when it comes to accountability, and what does not need to be integrated into the broader response around communication with communities. And so I'll just leave you with the last slide here with a quote from someone in Iraq receiving e-vouchers saying, "It's not fair for these strangers to decide which families are in need or not." And this feeling of, well, of course I'm in need, otherwise why would I stay here, I think really kind of sums up the challenges around accountability in these operational models. There is a tendency, and I think rightly so, to strive for efficiency and to define effectiveness and accountability from agencies' perspectives. But here what we're trying to encourage is to change that perspective and look back on aid recipients, what they consider priorities, how they like to interact with aid agencies, and how they would like to be involved in the design and implementation of CVA. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Louisa. What a brilliant tour of the state of the evidence overall, and a very, very good quote and food for thought to leave us on. Thank you so much. So moving now from the overall state of how we're doing, where we're succeeding, where we could be doing better, we're going to dive into one specific example, Chameleon, looking at scale cash and voucher assistance delivery in Lebanon. So Rachel, if we hand over to you then, what does Chameleon's research in Lebanon tell us about how operational models, an operational model, can approach accountability at scale? And what does it tell us about what the key features are of an operational model that can drive more accountable approaches? So over to you, and again, just shout at me and I will move through the slides.
Okay, thanks Sophie, and thanks for having me. So yeah, as Sophie said, I'm going to talk about the findings of a report commissioned by Chameleon, done in partnership with CaLP on accountability to affected populations in Lebanon's cash program through the lens of WFP. So first, what is Chameleon? So I guess you can go to the next slide. Okay, so Chameleon is an NGO-led network that includes NRC, Oxfam, and Solidarity, as well as other national and international partners. We conduct independent meal for WFP's multi-purpose cash program for Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So this is part of a new approach to deliver assistance, which also involves a consortium of donors. So if you're familiar with the context in Lebanon, you'll be aware that there's been changes, like pretty big changes in how cash is delivered to refugees in the past few years. Cash and vouchers have grown since 2014 and now represent about a third of the humanitarian response in Lebanon. There's been significant efforts to create new cash delivery models here that bring into practice some of the key grand bargain commitments for cash. So just briefly, these include cash coordination. WFP is part of Louise, a collaborative platform with UNHCR and UNICEF, which builds on joint systems while retaining separate programs. Big Cash, so 23,000 households receive cash assistance from WFP and 33,000 from UNHCR. So together, over 90% of multi-purpose cash is delivered by 2 agencies, compared to more than 30 agencies in 2016. And segregation of M&E duties. This is an extra layer of independent meal in the WFP program to generate more evidence, learning, and strengthen accountability. Lebanon is one of the first adopters of the ECHO ABC model and its global cash guidance, which encourages the formation of independent entity to conduct meal activities. So as part of its mandate, Chameleon partnered with CaLP to do a research study to generate evidence on how AAP is being consolidated in the design and delivery of program opportunities and constraints. The aim is to inform programming and generate wider learning. So I'm going to briefly go through some of the main findings of the study. So go to the next slide. Okay, so on the first slide, we thought we would have an infographic for you. This is a graphic that we'd keep referring back to throughout the study. Part of the desk review of the study looked through all of the guidance around AAP and cache programming and found that very little has been written with large-scale cache in mind. There's very little out there on minimum standards or existing thinking around what quality AAP looks like in a big cache project. So the idea of this graphic, it illustrates that there's an infinite amount of possibilities to invest in AAP. So there needs to be a balance struck in every design, and decisions need to be made about the proportion amount of investment in AAP. So next slide, please. Okay, so the first sort of key learning is based on that slide, on that infographic. So it's about the need to develop minimum standards and guidance on what is good enough for achieving AAP in large-scale programs and what constitutes an adequate balance in a particular context. So the second key learning is that selecting operational models for delivering cache at scale must consider AAP aspects and include the perspective of recipients. This is a bit similar to some of the things Luis was saying. Each operational model comes with its own considerations. The advantage in Lebanon is that you can harness technology, capitalize on mobile phone ownership, and the accessibility of ATMs. On the other hand, it means less face-to-face contact. It's more difficult to get perspectives of recipients. In the context of Lebanon, even if you involve a large percentage of the refugee population, it's still difficult to get to a point where this consultation is actually felt by the wider refugee population. It also means a high reliance on automated services like ATMs, call centers, and administrative targeting systems that are very difficult to explain to refugees, especially when in the past they're used to household visits. So we need to understand more about how these new automated processes are experienced and viewed by beneficiaries. So Ground Truth Solutions, they've sort of been at the forefront of this research with user journeys and user-centered design. So it's essential to find a balance in how these perspectives can be captured in order to inform and adapt the design of cache programs. So the next point is about establishing joint systems. It can be difficult in practice, but it's also very important to get it right. We all know how difficult it is to deliver a program when you're a single agency. But when you're delivering while operating with shared systems, there's an additional layer of complexity. For example, data sharing agreements between agencies is important to ensure that systems function to their full potential, and returns on investment and joint accountability systems are maximized. But this takes a significant amount of time and it needs to be factored in from the beginning. The next one is about giving third-party monitoring an appropriate mandate. So if independent monitoring is rolled out in similar contexts, it should be conceived in a way that takes into account any joint systems, and there's as much clarity as possible at the start about data access. This should include either providing a clear mandate to access the data needed from these joint systems, or defining the scope of the role of third-party monitoring accordingly that recognizes limitations on data access. The learning from Chameleon is that the scope of the work needed to evolve over time, and therefore it was not always possible to anticipate all these aspects from the start. And then the final point is in Lebanon, so the operational model has centralized many program functions, and this has led to a lot of gains in efficiency. But there's also a risk that it misses opportunities to fully utilize the role of cooperating partners who work directly with affected communities and can contribute to capturing beneficiary experiences, program effectiveness, and inclusion of the vulnerable. So based on the evidence emerging out of this study, cache actors globally should give thought to the operational and strategic roles that cooperating partners could play in these new ways of working. And then you can just move to the final slide. So basically these were some of the key learnings that came out of the report. I encourage everyone to read it if they have time. So here's the web address, or you can Google it, or feel free to contact me if you want to discuss any of this in further detail. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. Really, really interesting. And yes, I would encourage everyone to go away and read that report. It's a great one. Fantastic. So turning now to Alexandra from IFRC. We've heard a lot, and Louisa referenced this in the first presentation, but of course it's important as we do this that we're not only listening, we not only have the systems in place to get feedback, but then acting on what we hear. So how do we ensure that we close that loop from listening to acting? And how can recipient feedback drive continual adaptation and improvement of the systems we use? And what's the role of feedback in monitoring and evaluation? So Alex, over to you. And again, just shout when you want me to move to the next slide.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Well, thanks also for organizing this webinar, because I think it's really important to look at this issue of accountability in different ways. And I think Louise also mentioned this, and you mentioned that in your intro, Sophie, that often we think of cash assistance, and we definitely think, we make the assumption that there will be a shift in power imbalances and there will be better accountability. But to me, I think it's important to look at cash as any other sector, and to really think about how we need to better embed community engagement approaches and accountability mechanisms within what we do. And Sophie, you might remember this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when we were in Haiti some time ago, I still remember, because partners couldn't agree on whether to provide unconditional cash assistance or cash for work assistance in different communities. They went different ways in one community to another that were next to each other. So one got unconditional cash assistance, the other one got cash for work assistance, and hoping that, you know, communities who were sitting next to each other wouldn't talk to each other, wouldn't find out. So obviously create conflict and mistrust, and, you know, it had a really negative impact on the long term. And to me, that's no different than if we would actually be providing shelter or food, right, in this example. So that's why, even though cash has an immense potential, we really need to question everything we do as any other aid modality. So to the question of how do we ensure that we're, you know, really acting on what we hear, I mean, for us who work in this area of work globally and in different types of contexts, it's really the $100 million question. And I think, to me as well, the current Ebola epidemic in DRC, and also the one that we had in West Africa years ago, is always a compelling example, because in these cases, when we're not acting on what we hear, when it comes to an epidemic, it's really a matter of life or death, right? But somehow our systems are still not set up so that we can make changes and adapt to what communities are telling us. And currently in the Ebola epidemic, the Red Cross is really setting up a very comprehensive community feedback system, which is enabling us to understand what are the barriers in communities to really be effective and to stop the epidemic. But we're really struggling still to get responders to listen to this and adapt. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And recently, to look at this problem, we worked with CVA Collaborative to do some research across the Red Cross Red Crescent system to understand what were the enablers and barriers for meaningful community engagement and accountability. And in some ways, it confirmed what we already knew. And I think Louisa touched upon some of these aspects earlier. But it's also useful for us to kind of have some research to show us this evidence, because it can really help us advocate for the changes that we need to be able to operate. So I think for us to really be able to act on what we hear, there's certain building blocks that need to be put in place. And one of the issues that might be coming up in communities. And also the International Rescue Committee has looked into that, but also including in terms of references and in the way we hire staff to look at those soft skills that staff need to be able to listen to communities and to take into consideration what communities are telling us. So of course, because of that, we also need to be more agile and dynamic in the way we look at our organizational policies and our structures, and we need to be able to change that. And this is really where leaders can do something about that. The other building block, I think, which is really important, is what I like to call the kind of data challenge or the information challenge, where, you know, more and more, thanks to organizations like Ground Truth, we are having more and more information out there on what communities are telling us. And in the case I gave earlier in the Ebola response currently in DRC, we have this information. I think the problem still is how we capture it and how we share it and how we manage it. I think we're still not translating it enough in ways that are that information can be actionable. So sometimes it's great to know what communities are telling us, but what does that mean? How do we change our operations based on this information? That's a link that we're still not making enough when we're collecting information from communities. And we're also often making the assumptions that if we have good quality assessments at the outset of a project, then the rest afterwards will be relevant and effective, when instead we should really be doing that throughout the lifespan of a program. And the third aspect, of course, is that we need flexible conditions. And this, I won't get into it too much, but really we need to work with donors to ensure that we are able to change and adapt project designs and implementations along the way. And if that's not possible, if we don't have agreements with donors and partners on that, then of course it's just not going to be possible. So on the next slide, Sophie, thanks. The question really is how do we ensure that feedback drives continual adaptation and improvement? And for me, I think it's the thing is that we shouldn't look at feedback or feedback mechanisms in isolation. First, we should be making sure that we have different channels for receiving feedback, but we should also be looking at participatory approaches in everything that we do. This is just something that we really witnessed recently in Mozambique in the work the Red Cross did, where community engagement approaches was really the glue that held all the sectors together, all the work that we were doing in different areas together, because we were able to ensure that communities had a say in terms of selecting the criterias, and deciding on what priority areas we should focus on in the recovery process. And also, of course, this influenced the monitoring and evaluation of all the work we were doing in Mozambique. So for me, it's really important not to look at feedback in isolation, but also how we should be providing information to communities, gathering, responding to feedback, but also ensuring thorough participation that would lead ultimately to more community ownership. So in terms of you know, really, you know, the role of feedback in terms of monitoring and evaluation, I think, again, it goes back to this data challenge that we have, because if we're not the more, as I said earlier, the more information we gather, the more data we gather, how do we actually use it? And this is, I think, something that when we think about monitoring and evaluation, we have so much information, but we're not really using it to make long-term changes in our system, and really using that as part of our M&E processes. So I'm going to end this for now because I feel like I shared a lot of information, but I'm happy to answer a little bit more questions on this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. And we will certainly come back to you in the Q&A with more questions on that. So finally, last but not least, handing to our last speaker, Astrid. Astrid, as we mentioned in the beginning, is coordinating the joint UNHCR and WFP project on preventing abuses of beneficiaries enrolled in CVA programming. This is obviously an interagency program, so very interested to hear from you, Astrid, given the rollout of the UN Common Cash Statement at the moment. What steps have agencies taken to increase accountability in their joint work to date? And what do the findings say about the challenges and opportunities for interagency collaborations going forward? Over to you, Astrid.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the participants that have joined today. I'm happy to see there are so many people interested by the subject. I hope you can hear me fine. Just a little word about the project. Basically, UNHCR and WFP linked together for a project looking at mitigating the risks of abuse of power in cash assistance. What we thought is that basically, if you're a normal client of a bank or a mobile money operator, and you go to an agent in the field and you want to withdraw the cash, and the agent is rude to you or is asking you to pay an additional fee, you can say, okay, I'm not happy with the service of this provider. I just change, I go to the competition. What happened with cash assistance is that the people we are sending cash assistance to, they cannot choose the financial service provider they're getting the cash from. We are getting, as agencies or as NGO, a contract with specific financial service provider. And so our beneficiaries have to go to specific agents to withdraw the cash. So if I'm an agent in the field, I suddenly understand that I have a real power on the people that are there, for instance, close to a refugee camp, etc. And they need me for a life-saving assistance. So this is kind of an imbalance of power. And this, we thought, could lead to abuses of power. And that's how this whole project started. What we want with this project is to ensure that the people receiving the cash assistance feel they are protected and they are empowered as real clients of financial service provider. If you can go to the next slide. So in terms of the findings, so we went to 8 different countries since July 2018. And in terms of the findings, what happened is that many of the findings are actually related to accountability to affected people, which is interesting because, as Alexandra highlighted, this is not a problem that is specifically related to cash. It's really a problem of good programming in general. And so what we saw is that the first thing was that there is a lack of understanding of the process, of the cash process. Basically, when we went to the different countries that we visited, so last year we went to DRC, Cameroon, Iraq, Uganda, Rwanda, Chad, Afghanistan, and Burundi, and now heading to South Sudan and Niger. What we saw was that the people who we discussed with didn't know exactly how much assistance they're going to get, how long is it going to last, when do they need to withdraw, what's the real amount, and what's the fee they need to pay officially to the agent, what type of information they need to provide to the agent to withdraw their cash, etc. And what do they need to check before they sign the receipt that they've gotten their cash. So this lack of understanding can definitely lead to abuse of power. Because the agent can then abuse its position of power to either not give the full amount or ask for additional fees, which happen in different places because they want to compensate, for instance, for the security risks that they are taking to bring the cash in dangerous areas, so they don't obey to the official fees of their mobile money agency. Or they can ask for additional information about the persons, etc. And what we also saw was that the people who are assisted, they don't feel really confident in using a delivery mechanism, and above all, digital delivery mechanism, such as like the phones or maybe the bank card, because they might not be always familiar with this. And sometimes we are happy with a rapid training done by a mobile money operator, like many agents are coming and just training in one afternoon. A lot of people with actually very different capacity to process this information. And then we say, okay, training on the mobile phone use is done. And no, it's not working like that. People maybe don't really understand what a very tech-savvy agent is actually explaining, and maybe in a language they really don't master either. So this led, for instance, for examples such as the problems of the PIN. For instance, when people want to withdraw the money, they have to enter a 4-digit PIN. For us, it seems to be very easy to remember. And what we see in the field is that actually many people, they're really struggling to remember this PIN. So what happened is that we saw agents asking the people receiving cash assistance to use their date of birth as a PIN, which actually is not that great, because when you want to withdraw the cash, you have to show to your agent your date of birth on the ID, and the agent has a direct access to your money. So what happens is that some agent, they enter the PIN themselves, and they withdraw the money, put it on their own account. So this type of abuses takes place. Next slide, please. So what have we done today to mitigate these risks of lack of good communication and participatory approach to better share information on the cash process? We have developed a toolkit which will be released soon, and I see Coco is also online, so if you have any questions on the toolkit, you might ask also Coco, who is leading the development on this. And what we have in this toolkit is two aspects. One aspect are tools that are for humanitarian agency if you want to communicate better on your cash processes. So we're trying to develop posters, we try to develop visuals, role play, etc., to be used by implementing partners, to train the people who will receive cash assistance a bit more in depth on the cash process, but also the digital support that are being used for this cash delivery, for instance. And we also, another part of the toolkit is also targeted at the mobile money operators or the banks, so that they have, for instance, training for their agents, a little animation of 2 minutes they can disseminate through the mobile phone, and that is easy to watch, to explain that basically if the agents respect the rights of their client, even the most vulnerable, they will earn more money because more people will come to their desk. So we need to think a bit more in the win-win situation for the agents. So they need to understand why it's important to respect the rights of the people they assist. And we have developed other type of tools, such as how to not use the PIN, the date of birth as a PIN, etc. Next slide, please. So the other aspects that we saw in the different countries is a really lack of understanding of the complaints and feedback mechanism. Then that we've heard, there were months before and between the moment the complaint was put into the system and the moment it was solved. And this erodes confidence in the system. So people are scared that if they put a complaint that is a bit more sensitive and an abuse of power, it will take such a long time and there might be really retaliation, etc. The other point that we saw in the system, in the project, is that there is currently no referral system in place between the private sector customer service and our own agency or interagency system. But when people go to withdraw the cash, they have usually the phone number of the customer hotline that is displayed there. So it is important to discuss with the private sector and the financial service provider, saying, okay, if you receive a complaint of an abuse, how are we together as partner going to deal with this complaint so that the people are protected? And this is an aspect that we need to work with our private sector partner. Next slide, please. So what has been done to date to address this risk? Basically, we have an example, for instance, because I'm just back from Burundi. What we did is that we sat down in the transit center with all the partners that were there. So the implementing partner, the WFP, UNHCR, the government representation there, and the mobile money service provider that we are using. And we simulated the whole process to see where the risk of abuse of power and how could we ensure that all the complaint and feedback mechanism of each of the partner could talk to each other? And for that, we also used what had been developed by the Interagency Standing Committee task team on accountability to affected population, which was this community-based complaint mechanism, so the CBCM, so the Interagency CBCM. There is a whole manual that is available on the ISC task team, which guides step by step on how to set up interagency community-based complaints mechanism. And it's very helpful if you have a geographical setting where you have different systems, so to ensure that you still keep the different system, because it's good for people to have different doors to knock at, but you ensure that they are interrelated, they communicate to each other, and you ensure that they deliver an answer fast to the issues that are raised by the people. And we also provide support to nascent complaint and feedback mechanism, and also advocate for increased support to existing interagency systems. For instance, in Afghanistan, there is a wonderful AWAZ that's working, I mean, that's quite amazing in terms of the level of quality and efficiency, and that has such an amount of data that can be used then to help change programming according to the people's feedback. So we should really try and support this system and use them as much as possible when they're as good as this one. So last slide, just related to the fact that we need to altogether mitigate the risks linked with having a single financial service provider. For instance, if there is in one area a single financial service provider who will deliver all the cash assistance from UNHCR, WFP, and UNICEF in one area, there are a lot of positive aspects for the person who has a very simplified way to access the cash assistance, not many different cards or phone, etc. At the same time, we need to anticipate the fact that the agent from this chosen financial service provider will have even more power, because it's not only one agency cash that he's dealing with, but the three agencies cash. And so if this private sector agent knows he's in this situation of monopoly, he's the lifeline of the vulnerable people, the abuse may increase. And that's why we would like to highlight the importance that the tools that are being developed in this toolkit needs to be integrated from the beginning of the project if we use only one financial service provider, and we need to have really the discussion with this financial service provider on partnership. We could also use aggregators as an option when there is enough market maturity, and when the beneficiary, they have enough digital and financial literacy to be able to choose their own provider. So just to end up, WFP and UNHCR are hiring a joint resource I'm not sure if Sophie's there.
I'm here, sorry.
Okay.
We're having some technical problems on this end. Next, do you want the next slide?
It's if you can, yeah, move the next slide. Yeah, it was just the CaLP website. So this is the website of the project on the CaLP website. And the next one is the next slide is all the it's 4 pages each time, the lessons learned from the different countries, if people are interested. And on the little website, you can also find the 2 animations, which are like just 2 minutes and are really highlighting for the agents and for the people receiving cash assistance, the different risks that needs to be prevented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid. Really, really interesting. We are going to we are going to open up for questions now, but I'm going to take advantage of holding the mic to kick us off with the first question, if that's all right. So Astrid, my first question is to you, which is, I think this is super interesting work, and thank you so much for sharing the findings. It's obviously quite an intensive project with lots of field visits and sort of quite an intensive amount of research to hear from people what their experiences are of interacting with financial service providers. Are there any kind of general findings or general recommendations for this of how you can build models, how you can move forward in a way where this feedback is continually being picked up by providers and acted upon? Are there any findings in that direction?
Okay, so here,
And again.
a limited caseload for them. They are not earning a lot of money with us compared to other big contracts that they might have, and we're having a lot of demands on them. So we need to highlight with the financial service provider what they will win if they implement some of this mitigating measure. Some of these, including the feedback into a new product, for instance, or the new ways of working. And we usually discuss with the central banks in each country because we want to see what is the central bank regulation to protect the clients. And in our discussion with financial service provider, we highlight that basically if they train their agents better to protect the clients and to respect the clients, they are complying better to the regulation of their national central banks. On top of it, more clients will come to them. So it's not only our beneficiaries, but also all the vulnerable clients who suffer from situations in monopoly that exist in some remote areas of the countries that we visited. So we're trying to, I think it's important to frame the conversation around partnership and around the fact that what they invest for us is actually useful for all their customer base and for their brand image. We need to talk profit with them. I think that's, yeah, what's coming up. And they understand after a while. I mean, they really see it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Astrid. So before opening it to the floor, I wonder if any of the panelists, in listening to other panelists speak, have any questions, reflections on what you've heard today from others. Feel free either to raise a hand or just to unmute and jump in. If nothing from our panelists, then open to the floor. Any questions, reflections, thoughts, criticisms? We're open to it all. There should be if you right click on your name in the participants panel, there should be an option to raise a hand, and then I'll be able to bring you in one by one. If you can't find the hand raised, then just jump in. William, are you able to unmute and ask that out loud so that we can, those of us, including me, who are slower readers, can catch up?
Yes.
Thank
hello,
you.
everyone. William, US head of DA. And yes, thank you very much for the diagnostic. I think it's very well presented and to the point. And my question was about the leverage you think that are the more promising to improve AAP for CVA, because there were a couple of recommendations, and I'm sure, you know, variety of recommendations are important. But I was wondering, you know, do you think it's more promising on the legal framework side? We saw for the GDPR, it has positive impact on data protection, or the reputation of organization by benchmarking them, or by reinforcing the government capacity on that, or individuals' capacity, or just offering competition between the services we are providing to beneficiaries, or the technology as well. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, what are our entry points? What are the levers that we have for improving accountability in CVA delivery models? I could pick on any of our panelists for that, but Louisa, why don't you kick us off, and then we can bounce to others.
Sure. I think that it's quite interesting because there's a number of kind of intersecting issues that we see when we bring in some of these more, I would say, complex legal frameworks or new payment systems. And I think we have a risk with these operational models to forget the context in which a lot of these programs are implemented. So, for example, we have been working in the last 2 years in Chad, and the emergence of mobile money technology and digital transfer systems has been exponential. But this idea that everyone is able to access them equally is definitely a myth. At the same time, it would be naive to assume that humanitarians come in, sweep in, and are the first kind of contact with a financial system that people have. So I think the leverage there that we actually could improve upon is, on the one hand, working, so using this renewed focus on accountability to reorient the way field teams are interacting with communities, because people are going to the field all the time. It's just a question of what they're doing. Are they checking, you know, the shelter progress? Are they looking at whether people had a lost pin or helping them figure out that system? Is there a way to better structure that face-to-face interaction that could actually contribute to accountability and be a complement to hotlines? And then the second thing I would say is that, and this is me personally, not as Ground Truth, but as a cash practitioner now working with Ground Truth and working with a number of different partners on this issue, I still am quite frustrated to see how far behind we are on the technology of customer service. When you look at a lot of financial systems and service providers, yes, they might have issues with their networks, and a lot of mobile money networks are set up to be very decentralized and for agents to be their own kind of contractors, and therefore they might ask additional fees to vulnerable populations or in remote areas. But at the same time, we haven't learned enough about what it is that makes a good customer service experience that we can then apply to these kind of, let's say, more digital payment systems that could actually improve the way in which affected people, and particularly vulnerable segments of the affected people, experience that. And so I think that is something that we haven't yet leveraged, this idea of not just borrowing concepts from customer service or trying to speak the same language, but actually adapting systems, yet keeping kind of a humanitarian focus and making sure that it's not about, you know, profits or exploitation. It's and sorry, that was a very crude summary of private sector, let's say profits, and keep it kind of focused on what people are asking, which is just a better access, a more streamlined access to what are inherently complicated systems.
Thanks. A brilliant answer. And there's questions stacking up, so maybe I'll just I'll turn to one more of our panelists on this first question about what are the entry points, what are the points of leverage for actually improving on this. And Alex, if I could pick on you as our 1 foot in, 1 foot out of Cash World participant, what do you see from the IFRC perspective as the leverage points to really improve our performance on this?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. It's a really good question. I think there's definitely different elements. I mean, I obviously don't want to repeat myself when I said the presentation, but I do think the great leverage point is the way that the cash sector has been operating, just the amount of information that we currently have, and the fact that there's so much attention as well on this area from donors, just even at the grant bargain level, etc. I think that those elements together are, I think, really great leveraging points for us to try to be more accountable and to integrate better accountability systems in what we do. So I think for us, it's a question of like, so what do, again, as I said earlier, what do we do with all this information now? How do we make it as actionable as possible? And so in other contexts, I think often the issue is that we don't have information from communities, or we're not really there to listen from communities. But I think with a lot of the ways cash programmings are going now, we have that entry point, right? It's there. So we're already at a kind of next level. But the next level is, how do we really make that information actionable and really use it? So I think we need to kind of leverage that proximity that you have with communities by just the way that cash programming are being set up currently. I think that's what we really need to leverage. I don't know if that made any sense, sorry.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. And I see Patrick has two questions, one for Astrid and one for Rachel. So maybe Patrick, if you're able to unmute and ask both of those questions, we can give that a go in the next round.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, loud and clear.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the great presentations as well. My first follow-up question to Astrid was to say very impressive work to mitigate abuse of power by financial providers. I was just wondering whether you were using the same system to pick up information on UNHCR's and WFP's side of the business, so to speak, and to check the validity of the needs analysis and the targeting, for instance. And my second question was a bit broader. We've published recently a paper in CGD about people-driven responses, and we've flagged independence and transparency of AAP and feedback mechanisms more generally as a key principle. I'm just wondering whether there is any work to compare situations where those systems are independent, such as Chameleon and other systems, to see whether that is actually a benefit for people. For example, in terms of the fear that was mentioned by one of the presenters, in people reporting issues, for example. Over.
Great, thank you so much, Patrick. Great questions. So Astrid, let's bounce to you first for the first part of the question.
Yes, thank you. So Patrick, thank you for your question. Of course, I'm not putting all the risk on the side of the financial service provider, not at all. The project started as a focus on these aspects because basically it was not an aspect that had been developed or looked at before. And I thought and with WFP and UNHCR, we thought there was a risk there. But of course, of power on the other hand. I just wanted to jump back on the initial question regarding the leverage, and what we saw could be interesting is to use actually more the systems, like for instance, if you distribute the cash through a mobile phone, we are not capitalizing on the potential of distributing this mobile phone to these affected persons. They usually go to cash out once, and then they don't use it anymore, or they use it maybe if they have 2 or 3 other cash out, and then they don't use it anymore. But it's a massive tool that we can use for the communication, not only on the cash program, but why not send educational information? Why not use this phone to call and ask for protection monitoring questions, so we will know exactly who has the phone, etc. So there is a lot of leverage that we can do to improve the communication and the AAP using the tools that we take for the cash distribution. Yeah, just the last one on the independence of the third-party monitoring and AAP, I think what we saw is that there are either the systems that are the interagency systems, such as, for instance, ours in Afghanistan or the IDP call center in Iraq, and I'm sure there are others in other countries, but this one are the two that I specifically know. And the fact that you have all the agencies contributing to the pot is kind of mitigating the bias issue. But we also saw other countries where the feedback and complaints mechanism is outsourced to customer service that is being used, for instance, for mobile money, for the electricity company of the country, etc. So in Cameroon, WFP has contracted this type of service. And so it's kind of outsourced to a third party with specific skills to handle that, and who deliver every evening a kind of list of the different complaints and feedback received in a format that is very actionable. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Astrid. And then Rachel, maybe it's unfair to ask you for an objective assessment of third-party monitoring versus other types of M&E, but are you able to have a go at Patrick's second question?
Yeah, yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. So, I mean, so as Chameleon, we're not independently managing like the call center per se. So that's still run by WFP and UNHCR. We're more looking at sort of analysis and trends on the feedback. So, so for example, like that there was 1 million calls in the past 2 years, and about 70% of them are on targeting questions. So these types of sort of trends we're able to note and then provide recommendations to support WFP, evolve their program. And then we provide these recommendations, and then WFP is required to provide a response to them. But I'll just also mention that the AAP Did we lose Sophie again?
Hi, yes, we did, and now I'm back, and I'm very sorry about that. I'm going to assume that you finished your brilliant answer. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, I did finish. Thank you.
I think so. Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Thank you. So, Catherine, you had a question. You're up next. If you're able to unmute and ask the panelists your question, go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thanks everyone on the panel. Fantastic. I wanted to ask, and this goes a bit to Luisa and Astrid, but I'm sure the others can also add on to this. We know that from all the presentations we've seen, there is really need to be super flexible to adapt to context changes that, as we know, in conflict areas, protracted crises, are very, very fluid and can change from one day to the next. So that adaptation is required, but at the same time, coordination across multiple stakeholders. So this is also very difficult. Now, from what we've heard and what we've also experienced in World Vision, holding service providers accountable, whether that's NGOs, UN, or private sector, is one thing. But it becomes even more complicated and complex if we're looking at institutional duty bearers. And I'm actually alluding to another discussion thread that CaLP is co-hosting and is big in the cash week probably. It's the linkage, or strengthening the linkage between humanitarian cash voucher assistance and social protection. In social protection, as we know, there's policies, and actually there is a lot of community engagement and holding governments accountable to implement what they've committed towards. So that is social accountability. For me, the key question is, how can we strengthen the linkage between humanitarian accountability to affected populations, but bringing in this kind of segment as well, because it becomes more and more relevant for us to work with government stakeholders as well. Thank you.
Catherine, any of our panelists want to reflect on the social protection angle?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great,
Just
thank you.
for the project, each time we have a meeting, I mean, there is as part of a mission, a kind of high-level meeting that we do, and we invite the government social protection or social safety net, because basically what they do, they also transfer cash assistance, and they usually also select one financial service provider for hundreds of thousands of people. So they have exactly the same type of issue, and that's why it's quite interesting to bring them into the equation. We also have all the discussion with the cash working group. I saw in one of the questions the mention of, do you work with the cash working group and what's the role of the cash working group? Definitely, when we do this mission, we really involve the cash working group from the first day, but also at the end to really draft an action plan together, and then we also deploy a consultant to stay there to help the both agency plus the cash working group to solve the issues that have been raised. And so the importance of collaborating with the government social safety net is that they usually use a similar financial service provider, and so they have the same type of issue of needing a good feedback and system, complaints and feedback mechanism, and also needing to see how the complaints and feedback mechanism for the social protection system is also linked with the complaints and feedback mechanism that exists at the central bank level, which manages the financial service provider and their potential abuses. And the telecommunication regulator also has a feedback and complaints mechanism in place. And so how are those linked together so that there is a proper answer if abuses are reported, and also to integrate positive feedback or changes in terms of the programming approaches. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Astrid. And Catherine, you mentioned your question was also directed at Louisa, I think. Louisa, any reflections following Astrid's?
I think that's an interesting one, and I'm not going to even pretend to have an answer at the global level on some challenges that have been going on for years. I think one of the things we've remarked from, let's say, cash recipients' perspectives is that they might have a very different idea of what it means to hold government entities accountable. And I think one of the things that's perhaps missing that could help piece those things together, and I don't think that it would be a perfect fit in terms of, you know, making the puzzle pieces come together, is just thinking about people's, so community and particularly aid recipients' previous relationship with those government entities. Because often what's happening with the social protection schemes when they're linking up with either development actors or humanitarian actors is that they may be coming into regions or areas or working with communities that have not had a lot of contact with them, or have had a very specific type of contact that hasn't been assistance-based. And I think that to their credit, there's a lot of, there are a lot more expectations on social protection systems than there might be on humanitarian systems, simply because in a lot of contexts, people know what to expect. So it might be kind of the social safety nets, or, you know, in Central African Republic, the kind of touch and go on and off different schemes where people have been receiving aid. So there might be on the one side more frustrations. At the same time, what we have been hearing from populations that receive cash and voucher assistance, humanitarian, and then what we might call more social protection schemes, is that they don't necessarily make the difference in terms of who's in charge of what and who's accountable. For them, it's more about the length of assistance. And so there is a clear preference towards social protection schemes because they tend to provide assistance for longer, which means that then it's also obviously understandably easier to navigate the system. So I know it doesn't really fully answer your question, but I would say one of the ways in which it could be a productive kind of approach to accountability of these different entities and who is supposed to be held to account would be to look at from cash recipients' perspective and see the different kind of touch points or interactions that they have either with financial service providers who might be acting as the delivery
to go ahead with the question?
Sure. Yes, I think that Astrid touched upon a bit. I think that, well, first, thanks to all the panels, I think that this shows how these emerging topics, how diverse is the ecosystem and the multiple stakeholders. I think that Ground Truth Solution shows from a quantitative and research perspective, the Red Cross shows how we have to focus on participatory approaches, as well as the role of private sector, and Chameleon, the linkages with the operational stakeholders. So I post my question on the chat because there's so much information and so many stakeholders on the ground. How can we? What was the perspective of the different panel members on how can we improve or leverage the role that cash working group are having by now, and how has been their interlinkages with the different platforms from the different other panels. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jimena. So maybe Rachel, given that you haven't had a question for a while, and that there's been a long-standing relationship with the Basic Needs Working Group in Lebanon, maybe you could get the ball rolling on that one, relationship between Louise and Chameleon and the Basic Needs Working Group.
Oh, hey, sorry. Okay, so the question is, what do we expect from Cash Working Group on this emerging topic? I mean, I think in Lebanon, this has been a reoccurring topic, and since sort of the world of cash has sort of transitioned from NGOs, and UN having, multiple different programs with multiple objectives and not being able to agree very much on what any kind of accountability standards are, to having, and also sort of having more, sorry, I'm just thinking aloud here, having more of the way to target households be based on household visits and being able to actually have a bit more interaction. So things have sort of morphed into having less organizations and having a desk-based system where there's less interactions. And I think the
panelists want to respond to that question. If not, we'll move on to the next question.
Thanks so much, Supendi, for covering me. So I may have missed some questions in the chat box, and if so, I'm sorry for that. But we had the next question was queued up by someone mysteriously named Johnny Cash. So Johnny Cash, if that is your real name, please unmute and ask us your question.
Well, it's kind of my real name, for those who know me. Yeah, my question really is about these listening exercises at scale. Obviously, we're talking about cash at scale, and how do we then have a rigor in the listen exercises so we're not just replacing one stranger with another, to be able to really understand people's perspectives when we're talking about our assumptions, particularly around how we design our programs and then test those assumptions. And if we're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of potential beneficiaries or recipients of assistance, how or what sort of techniques are we thinking about to ensure we have that level of rigor so that we can really say that we understand people's perspectives? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Can we bounce that in the first instance to Alex for your thoughts, and then maybe turn to Louisa after you.
Yes, especially that Johnny Cash is actually my colleague, so it's perfect. Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and obviously, in my opinion, really looking at the qualitative information that you're getting from communities at a, especially if you're looking at a large scale initiative like in Turkey from your chat. I think it's really important. This is what we learned for instance, in the Ebola DRC context currently, where we have a very thorough community feedback system. Obviously, we are not targeting every single household that might be targeted by the epidemic or the response, but we have a large enough sample, and I can't give you the numbers off the top of my head right now because they're not in front of me, but it's large enough that we can look at all the qualitative information that we're getting through our volunteers, and we're going from household to household to collect this information. We're having really open-ended conversations with people and collecting this qualitative information that's later analyzed. And once you start seeing patterns of certain issues that keep coming up, this is when you're not really singling out the issue of one individual, right? That there's maybe really a comprehensive issue in the way that you're designing your response, your initiative, or whatever it might be. And so I think this is where we really need to invest the resources in gathering that qualitative information. I mean, we have a tendency of obviously to rely on quantitative information when we want to survey, especially large kind of populations. But I do think it's worth, especially when we look at the Red Cross, Red Crescent, we have that added value that we have an incredible network of volunteers that we can leverage and train to do this kind of thing. And that's where we need to get better as well at the analysis of this kind of qualitative information. And that's when you kind of start looking at patterns. I mean, for instance, in DRC, we started being able to almost predict security incidents that were about to happen in certain communities because of what we were hearing. Even though we weren't surveying every single person, we started noticing different patterns and different issues that kept coming up, and our security team started using the data we were collecting, even though that was not the purpose of the data collection, but our security team started looking at it because it was such valuable information on what it was really getting at the pulse of what was happening at a larger scale in the community. So that would be my answer. I don't know if it answers all the issues.
Brilliant answer. Thank you, Alex. So conscious that we're now at time, maybe I could just ask Louisa if she has any final thoughts on that question, and then I will try to wrap us up in a couple of sentences. So Louisa, over to you.
Super, I'll keep this brief. I totally agree with what Alexandra was saying, and Johnny, your question is really pertinent because we kind of get overwhelmed at this idea of level of rigor at scale, right? But it's precisely that. It's the balance between quantitative and qualitative. We've gotten a lot of feedback that the quantitative is most appreciated by aid recipients when it's short, and when they cash and voucher assistance. What differentiates people's different experiences, and how can we better capture that so that people feel that they have ways to access the assistance in the most efficient manner for them?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louisa. Fantastic. Great. So we're at time. I would love to let this run and run. These have been such fantastic presentations and really, really good questions, and I would love to see where this goes. We'll have the opportunity to pick up these issues in our event during Cash Week, which will be recorded and available to those of you who aren't able to be in London in December. I think, yes, to echo Jimena's point, we need to get a lot better at building in participatory approaches at all stages of the program cycle. I think this is, I mentioned earlier, I think this is sort of the least radical idea in humanitarian assistance, is listening to the people we serve and doing what they say. And the evidence on this is pretty.
Wish you a good evening.
Technology not on my side today. I am so sorry, everyone. Just a huge, huge thank you to our brilliant panelists. This recording will be available online. Sapenzi has kindly volunteered to draw out some of the key recommendations. Huge, huge thanks to our panelists. This was brilliant, inspiring, lots of food for thought. Apologies for the technical glitches on my end. I hope they didn't interrupt your listening experience too much. And looking forward to seeing many of you in London for Cash Week. Thanks a lot.